This opening move, e4, immediately fights for central space and opens diagonals for both the queen and the king's bishop, setting the stage for active piece development and potential early tactical opportunities. This move, 1, circa 5, initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and complex opening that immediately creates an imbalanced pawn structure and fights for central space on the queenside. This move develops a knight towards the center, contesting control of d5 and preparing for kingside castling, common in many variations of the Sicilian defense. This move signals black's intention to enter the Sicilian defense, specifically a setup that often leads to king's Indian or dragon-like structures, where black will develop the kingside knight to f6 and the bishop to g7, creating a solid pawn center and potential kingside attack. This move immediately challenges black's pawn on circa 5, opening lines for white's pieces and aiming to create central pawn tension characteristic of the main lines of the open Sicilian defense. This captures the central pawn, opening the c-file and clarifying the pawn structure in what is the main line of the open Sicilian defense. This captures the central pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic play characteristic of the open Sicilian. This developing move in the open Sicilian, specifically the 4 knights variation, challenges white's central pawn control and prepares to contest the initiative. This move develops the knight to a central square, prepares for castling, and maintains the pressure on black's d6 pawn, a common continuation in the open Sicilian. This move, 5, a6, is characteristic of the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, a popular and sharp opening, aiming to prevent white's d5 pawn push and prepare a queenside expansion with b5. This move, f4, aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to build a strong pawn chain, signaling an intent to develop a kingside attack or control more central space. This move initiates a sharp Sicilian dragon variation, immediately contesting the center and opening lines for both kings. Developing the knight to f3 here prepares for castling and supports the d4 pawn, typical in the main lines of the Sicilian Najdorf after white's 6, f4. This move prepares to support the d6 pawn and potentially develop the c8 bishop, while also creating a flexible position within the open Sicilian. This move develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to castle and support the central pawn push e4 e5, a common thematic idea in the classical Sicilian variation. This move, 8, nbd7, is a common response in the Sveshnikov Sicilian, reinforcing the d6 pawn and preparing for the upcoming pawn push e5 or potentially supporting a queenside buildup with b5. Castling kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, preparing for central play and potential pawn breaks. This move aggressively expands on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially create counterplay against white's central pawn structure, characteristic of many variations within the Sicilian defense. This move prevents black's intended queenside expansion with b4, aiming to control the a4 square and prepare for a potential pawn advance later. Developing the bishop to b7 reinforces control of the long dark squared diagonal, which can become a significant attacking avenue in this Sicilian Najdorf variation. This move tucks the king away from the queenside pawn storm and potential attacking lines along the c-file, preparing for queenside expansion and improving king safety. Developing the kingside further with g6 prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and bolster the kingside's defenses against white's central pawn push and knight development. This move prepares to castle kingside, consolidating white's king position while developing the bishop to a more active diagonal and supporting the central pawn push. This move initiates an aggressive knight sortie into white's territory, directly challenging the f4 pawn and potentially disrupting white's pawn chain while creating attacking chances on the kingside. This move prepares to reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal or supports the advance of the e-pawn, while also defending the c3 knight. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the kingside advance and preparing for potential kingside play after the d6 pawn is advanced. This pawn push aggressively challenges the center and aims to open lines for white's pieces, potentially targeting black's king or creating weaknesses in the pawn structure. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially challenging white's central control and offering counterplay on the queenside. This move aggressively targets the f7 pawn, aiming to exploit white's weakened king's side and potential weaknesses created by black's g6 pawn structure. This move defends the knight on g4 and prepares to challenge white's attacking pawn on f5, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This retreat of the knight to h3 aims to reroute it to a more active square, potentially f4 or g5, while also clearing the way for the f-pawn to advance further, thereby challenging black's control of the e5 square. Black continues to solidify their kingside pawn structure, aiming to create a protective shield and potentially launch a counterattack on the kingside later in the game. This knight repositioning to f2 aims to reinforce the kingside and potentially explore options like moving to e4 or g4 later, anticipating black's continued kingside aggression. The move nc5 is a good move, developing a piece and attacking the d3 bishop and also preparing to push the c-pawn to c4. This move aggressively challenges black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses and potentially open lines for attack after captures. This exchange simplifies black's position, removing a potentially active knight and preparing to contest the central dark squares with their queen. This capture opens the c-file for white's rook and removes black's knight from a critical defensive square, allowing white to potentially exert more pressure on black's kingside and queenside pawn structure. The move qd7 repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to potentially challenge white's control of the d-file and prepare for future pawn advances. On the queenside, this move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting kingside expansion or preparing to shift focus to the queenside attack. The move rc8 directly contests the open c-file, a critical strategic objective, and prepares to apply pressure on white's queenside pawns, particularly the advanced b4 pawn. This move initiates a pawn race on the queenside, aiming to open lines and create threats before black can fully consolidate their central position and prepare a kingside attack. Black finally castles, securing the king's safety and preparing to bring the remaining rook into play, while white has been actively pushing on the queenside. This move aims to open lines on the queenside, challenging black's solid pawn structure and creating tactical possibilities for white's pieces. This pawn exchange on b5 opens the a-file for white's rook and demands black's immediate attention to its queenside structure and potential weaknesses. This move prepares to activate the rook on the semi-open a-file, potentially creating threats against black's queenside pawns and supporting further expansion. This move immediately challenges white's central control and aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, while potentially creating a passed pawn on the d-file if white captures. This move resolves the tension in the center, opening the e-file for white's rook and preparing for further pawn advances or piece activity on the queen side. This move is a crucial reclamation of the central pawn, aiming to equalize the material and open lines for piece activity after the complex exchanges. This move reclaims the pawn lost on d5, centralizing the knight and preparing to exploit the open c-file for your rook. The recapture of the pawn reopens the d-file for white and places black's queen on a more active square, potentially eyeing weaknesses along the c-file and the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the d5 pawn and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or advance the queenside initiative. This move opens the d-file and supports the central pawn push with nc5, aiming to increase pressure on white's queenside pawns. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the central pawn push and contest the long dark squared diagonal that could become important later. This move decisively removes white's active queen and forces simplification, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and open files that will arise after further exchanges. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, offering white an advantage in the subsequent rook endgame due to black's slightly compromised pawn structure on the queenside and white's more active king. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where black must carefully manage their advanced d-pawn. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to contest control of key squares and potentially attack weaknesses in black's position. This move strategically centralizes the rook on the open d-file, reinforcing the pawn on d5 and preparing to contest white's pieces for control of the endgame. This move exchanges a knight for a pawn, simplifying the position and opening up the possibility of exploiting the weak dark squares on black's queenside after the upcoming pawn push. This move seeks to exploit white's temporarily misplaced rook on a5 by creating an immediate threat on the first rank. The king repositions to the safer g1 square, clearing the d1-h5 diagonal for potential piece activity and offering more defensive cover. The move 31, rxe1 is a critical simplification, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and open files by trading off black's remaining rook, a necessary step before initiating an attack. This move finally clarifies the material balance, resolving the recent exchanges and setting up a playable endgame where white's remaining pieces can be coordinated more effectively. This exchange of rooks resolves the immediate tension on the first rank and simplifies into a king and pawn endgame where white has a material advantage with their extra passed pawn. With the enemy rook now on the first rank and the kingside severely compromised, the king must be centralized to participate in the defense and potentially counterplay. This move recaptures the rook and re-establishes material equality, but critically activates white's king, allowing it to participate in the defense of the e-pawn and potentially swing over to the kingside. After a complex sequence of exchanges and positional maneuvering, white's recapture of the b5 pawn with the rook aims to exploit black's compromised queenside pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns on the kingside. The bishop returns to its square to defend the rook, repositioning for potential counterplay on the central files while preparing to contest the open d-file. This move recaptures the pawn, aiming to simplify the position and enter an endgame where white's extra pawn may be decisive, although black's pieces remain active. Black recaptures the pawn, aiming to activate their rook on the open file and challenge white's material advantage. White aims to recover the sacrificed exchange by attacking black's isolated queen's pawn and creating pressure on the queenside. This capture simplifies the material by trading off a minor piece for a bishop, reducing white's attacking potential and creating a pawn structure that favors black in the endgame. Due to the connected passed pawns on the queenside, this endgame presents white with a passed pawn on the a-file. But black's rook is very active on the first rank, and white's king is still exposed. This move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the rook into potentially dangerous central squares. This move aims to centralize the king, which is crucial for endgame play to support the remaining pawns and potentially challenge black's active rook. This move aims to regain material advantage and improve piece activity by challenging white's rook on the f-file and centralizing the knight. This move aims to exploit the exposed kingside and potentially create a passed pawn on the g-file, while also restricting black's rook activity. This move aims to consolidate white's material advantage by repositioning the rook to a more active square and potentially creating threats against white's kingside pawn structure. This move aims to support the advanced pawn on h3 and prevent black's rook from utilizing the g4 square to attack the f2 pawn or pressure white's kingside. This move aims to create an active passed pawn on e4, which will require white's full attention and potentially lead to exchanges that benefit black's king and rook. This move aims to activate the rook along the open file, preparing to contest black's advanced passed pawn on e4. This checking move forces the white king to a less secure square, centralizing black's rook and preparing to exploit white's vulnerable kingside pawn structure. The king's capture on e4 resolves the immediate threat of the black rook and pawn and aims to consolidate material advantage, transitioning the game towards an endgame where white is still up a pawn. Black's rook recapture on h3 is a strategic concession, allowing white to consolidate material advantage and improve their king's safety while black remains down material. The move k5 aims to centralize the king in the endgame and supports the advanced passed pawn on f4. This move aims to disrupt white's king position after the pawn sacrifice, forcing it to move again and allowing black to consolidate its material advantage. This move aims to centralize the king, bringing it closer to the action to support the rook and potentially participate in the endgame, while also creating an escape square on g7 for the king if needed. This is a tactical check that forces the opposing king back, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create mating threats or regain material by exploiting the exposed position. The current position features white's king venturing out to e5, a bold but potentially precarious move, as black's rook on f3 and bishop on e3 can create threats and exploit the king's exposed location. The move 45kg7 is a pragmatic decision to centralize the king, seeking safety and potential defensive support in the upcoming endgame, while preparing to potentially activate it further. The king has moved to the center of the board, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame by controlling central squares and potentially supporting a passed pawn. The king retreats to g6 to maintain activity and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also anticipating white's queen repositioning. White's move seeks to exchange the rooks and simplify into a more manageable endgame where the passed pawn advantage on the queenside might be more easily exploited, though black's kingside pawn is also advancing. The move 47 Rf4 repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to control the fourth rank and potentially create counterplay against white's king, while also preparing to support any pawn advances. The rook on g1 is now centralized and supports the pawn on g4. aiming to prevent black's pawns from advancing further and to control the kingside. With the pawns on the kingside now fixed and black's king somewhat exposed, this move aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside and potentially open lines for counterplay against white's somewhat passive king. This move capitalizes on the pinned black king and creates a passed pawn, forcing a crucial decision for black and opening lines towards the weakened kingside. The black king steps into the open, centralizing on f5 to contest the crucial e4 square and prepare for potential pawn advances, aiming to activate the remaining pieces. The rook on h1 is now actively placed on a file that is likely to open further, creating dangerous attacking potential against black's king. The rook on h1 now actively supports the king's safety and prepares to defend the g-pawn, while white's king aims for central influence in the endgame. The king advances to e5, a critical positional decision to centralize and support the pawn majority on the kingside for a potential endgame advantage. The move extends the kingside pawn chain, aiming to create space and potential attacking opportunities by advancing the pawn to h4, while also providing shelter for the king if it needs to move back. The rook on d1 is repositioned to a more active file, aiming to control the central open file and potentially support the advance of the h-pawn or challenge black's king. The move 52, h4 aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside by advancing the pawn furthest from white's king, potentially disrupting white's defensive coordination. This move aims to create defensive harmony on the kingside, consolidating the pieces and preventing black's passed h-pawn from advancing further by offering a pawn sacrifice to create counterplay or force a draw. This move, 53, kh5, aims to reposition the king to a more active square on the kingside, preparing for potential pawn advances and avoiding further checks from white's rook. This endgame sees white's rook aiming to control the h-file, a critical open file that offers potential attack against black's king while simultaneously preventing black from advancing their dangerous passed pawn on the h-file. This move attempts to bring the rook into a more active position, but it allows white's rook to gain control of the important h-file, which will likely be used to attack black's king. The rook on d1 maintains control of the central file and supports the advance of the king, aiming to consolidate white's advantage. With white's rook positioned on the open g-file and black's king still somewhat exposed, advancing the h-pawn can create critical attacking chances by opening lines and forcing concessions, or it can overextend if not adequately supported by other pieces. The king must advance to support the advanced passed pawn and contest the open g-file for potential endgame advantages. Black's king is remarkably active, marching towards the queenside where a pawn endgame is imminent, aiming to utilize its centralizing presence and potentially create counterplay against white's advanced pawns. This move secures the king and prepares to bring the rook to a more active position on the 7th rank, where it can put pressure on black's pawns and potentially support a king hunt. This move repositions the rook to the open 1st rank, preparing to contest control of the critical file and potentially support a passed pawn advance or attack black's king. This move aims to consolidate white's advantage by bringing the rook back to a more active position, potentially preparing to support the kingside pawn push or control open files. The move focuses on creating a passed pawn on the kingside by advancing the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create new mating threats. This move aims to utilize the open h-file to potentially create new threats against black's king or to support a pawn push. This move is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn on the h-file. But white's king is too active and can easily support its pawns, making this pawn push unlikely to succeed.